This is my League starter Explosive Trap Trickster. The build is good for its high single target burst potential, which it accomplishes through efficient physical to elemental damage conversion scaling via extra damage and resist reduction / penetration, as well as critical strike cap utilizing curses, exposure, and alternative ailments. It takes advantage of the fact that trap and mine clusters on the tree are very good, and trap and mine mechanics, while a bit clunky, allow for massive front loading of damage on bosses, essences, legion generals, anything that needs to be activated. This build has been around and pretty strong for a while now, but patch 3.23 massively improved on the innate weaknesses of the build, which were clear and sustained. The transfigured gem Explosive Trap of Shrapnel boasts higher base damage at the cost of concentration because the smaller explosions come in a larger spread. This is a buff for clearing. The introduction of charms and the insanely powerful new unique jewel, That Which Was Taken, are a great way to round off builds by providing easy access to stats which can be a bit hard to access in certain places. For this build specifically, it allowed me to add much needed life sustain and ease the gear pressure to cover basic stats such as resistances and suppression. Without having played the build prior to this, overall it's a much stronger all-rounder in 3.23 than it would have been before. The bossing is about as strong as it was before the patch, but everything else is just way better. Without the changes, I think I would have re-rolled a mapping character sooner, but after some upgrades, I found mapping on this character as enjoyable as a trap character can feel for mapping. Now, of course, Path of Exile has scaling options that allow you to make the game extremely hard at points, and the new Affliction mechanic pushes this through the roof. So of course you can easily kill this build by combining multiple careless decisions, but in general, if you roll your maps and read your altars carefully, it's kinda hard to die with this character. Sure, it's not a tank, but it is definitely not the glass cannon you would assume it is when looking at the damage output. The Path of Building link for the current state of the character with around 17.5 million Shaper DPS at level 94 and about a 30 to 50 divine total investment is in the description below. I really wanted to play a solid starter this league, and bossing seemed like a good choice, so before we even knew about the transfigured gems, I had laid eyes on this Explosive Trap build guide by a YouTuber called Fearless Dumbo, which I want to credit here for most of the build decisions. It's a very comprehensive build guide that I can wholeheartedly endorse, and I will also link it in the description below. I'll try to explain most of the important interactions and mechanics, but as always, you could talk for hours about how a PoE build works, so I have to cut it off somewhere. So if there's any questions remaining, don't hesitate to put them in the comments down below, and I will do my best to answer them. We are using Explosive Trap, which is a skill that throws a trap which then casts a damaging spell. The spell deals physical damage based on gem levels and converts 50% of its physical damage to fire damage. It first deals damage in a single explosion at the center of the trap, and then follows up with a number of smaller damaging explosions which vary in size and randomly spawn within a radius around the center. The transfigured version Explosive Trap of Shrapnel offers around 30% more base damage as well as 20% higher added damage effectiveness. Its smaller explosions have a higher base radius and are spread within a wider radius around the center. It is generally better than the base version, with the exception of small and medium-sized high hit point targets, for which the base gem provides somewhat better damage as more of the explosions overlap. We convert the remaining physical damage into cold damage using the cold mastery from the tree and the Syndicate bench-crafted prefix on the gloves. We also gain a bunch of physical as extra cold damage from the cold cluster leading up to the cold mastery, as well as the hatred aura. The build is crit capped at 100% critical strike chance in most situations, and totals 450% critical strike multiplier against cursed enemies. It lowers their resistances with elemental weakness, Snowforged, and the alternate fire ailment Scourge, as well as cold exposure. Enemies also take 31% increased damage because they are unnerved and shocked, and up to 66% if also marked and bear trapped as well. The bear trap needs to be thrown, but the two curses, Elemental Weakness and Assassin's Mark, are both applied via a single cast of Arcanist's Brand. This really only needs to happen on bosses and some super juiced rares. Generally, just throwing explosive traps is fine. For some extra burst damage, we can also activate the Holy Relic Guardian's Blessing, which provides another 16% more damage multiplier. The build gets around using Shield Charge and Frostblink, which can and should be swapped for Flame Dash for certain encounters. For survivability, we're running a cast when damage taken setup with Immortal Call, which consumes endurance charges for a short but very strong damage mitigation buff in case we take any meaningful amount of damage. Like pretty much every build in Path of Exile, we're stacking some mana reservation efficiency to be able to run more reservations. In this case, we're running Grace for huge evasion, Clarity for mana regeneration to sustain the high trap throwing speed, Hatred for extra cold damage and more cold damage, and Skitterbots, which are huge value for trappers. Not only do they provide 10% more trap and mine damage, but also chill and shock to enemies near them at guaranteed values 21 at level 21. This allows the build to still benefit from chill and shock, as well as conditional bonuses against enemies that are chilled or shocked, while using Secrets of Suffering. Secrets of Suffering is a keystone passive skill that can only be accessed via items. In this case, we're using the Alternating Scepter base type. With Secrets of Suffering, the character is unable to directly apply the traditional elemental ailments Ignite, Chill, Freeze, and Shock, and instead can inflict the alternative ailments Scorch, Brittle, and Sap. Scorch, the alternative fire ailment, causes targets to have their elemental resistance reduced by up to 30%. Brittle, the alternative cold ailment, causes hits against brittle enemies to have up to plus 6% chance to critically strike. Sap, the alternative lightning ailment, causes targets to deal up to 20% less damage. These ailments work similar to the way that shock works in that the size of the hit determines the magnitude of the effects. We scale them with increased effect of non-damaging ailments from critical strikes from the crit mastery. We convert our physical damage into fire and cold damage only, so normally we can only guarantee consistent Scorch and Brittle, but since we hit so many times individually, a single 10-ish% of physical damage as extra damage of a random element is enough to sap in many cases as well. Altogether, the build sits at 17.5 million Shaper DPS with all buffs and debuffs up, and it's not unrealistic to be able to kill most enemies within uptime of everything, since we can front load about 4 seconds worth of damage on any triggerable target like a map boss, Conqueror, Guardian, Essence, etc. But even if you can't get a target down immediately, the build can usually hold itself quite well in a fight. We got 5.3k EHP in the form of roughly 4k life and 1300 energy shield. We also have 28,000 evasion rating unbuffed, which goes up to above 40,000 with the Jade Flask active. Like most Trickster builds, we also have Ghost Shrouds, which are huge energy shield sustain with this amount of evasion. Of course, we are suppression capped with positive chaos resistance and some block chance from running with a shield. Interestingly, Trickster provides an extra 10% damage suppressed while on full energy shield, which makes the build less susceptible to one-shots from large spell hits, as well as a 50% chance for the energy shield recharge to start when you suppress, which is whenever you get hit by spells, so this triggers quite often. Between energy shield recharge, Ghost Shroud recovery, and the instinct 50 energy shield when you suppress, the energy shield sustain is amazing, but naturally you don't have much life recovery in this side of the tree. We would be a sitting duck against damage over time effects without our life flask. But thanks to the borrowed power from Affliction, we were able to stack 2 Guardian Charm mods with 20% of life regenerated over a second each, which provides a nice almost 1700 HP boost every 4 seconds. One of the mods is actually not on the charm, but on a super nice That Which Was Taken jewel, which also provides 4% life recovery whenever I press a flask, physical as extra random element, and some complementary spell suppression. This allows me to decide whether I use my instant recovery life flask when I get hit, or just sit it out and wait for the regeneration to kick in, especially in boss fights where you know the time intervals between enemies' abilities. On top of that, we're utilizing an Enduring Composure small cluster jewel notable together with our cast when damage taken setup, which is a very common form of defense in builds that don't have large amounts of armor to use for Molten Shell. When the character gets hit for a total of 583 damage, Immortal Call gets triggered and consumes 3 endurance charges to provide 27% less elemental damage taken and 72% less physical damage taken for 2.3 seconds. Every second after getting hit, an endurance charge is generated, so after 3 seconds we're back at the starting point. Thanks to Trickster charge duration, charges last around 32 seconds total, so they're usually up when you need them. Now to go over my gear choices, most importantly we use an alternating scepter with a +1 mod and spell damage as well as some spell crit. For starters, you can just make a +1 fire gem scepter with the recipe by selling the white scepter to a vendor with skill gems that have the fire tag and a total of 40% quality. This one I was lucky to hit while fossil crafting, using 3 socket resonators with Aberrant, Etheric and Scorched fossils socketed. The scepter is complemented with an ES shield with large amounts of spell damage and spell critical strike chance, as well as some life and regeneration. Another important slot is the glove slot, because the Eldritch Implicits can roll both Cold Exposure and Unnerve on Eater and Exarch mods respectively. You definitely want a free prefix to craft the conversion to cold mod here. In this case, I also managed to get gloves with the Temple affix that provides increased damage with hits against chilled enemies. Remember, because of Secrets of Suffering, I cannot chill directly, but my skitterbots still do. On the helmet, we're looking for the Mana Reservation Efficiency Essence mod from Essence of Loathing, combined with the Eater Implicit Mana Reservation Efficiency mod. Since every trickster wants to be an escape artist, we also want lots of energy shield on the helmet slot, as it gets added as evasion at 5 times the value. This means this helmet is like a permanent jade flask on top. I had an open prefix and could have crafted a bit more energy shield with the hybrid mod, but I opted to craft +1 area of effect gems and put my auras into it, which is overall a bit more value than the energy shield would have been. Another important thing to look out for is free prefixes on both rings and amulet to craft -7 to mana cost of skills. Without these, it's very hard to be able to sustain throwing traps, especially because triggered skills going off also cost mana. On my rings, I went for big mana and life rolls and applied the appropriate quality, which also brings the -7 crafts up to -8. On the amulet, I needed a lot of strength and +1 fire. The other stats are more of a lucky coincidence. For the anoint, originally I went for high voltage, but I have swapped for Disciple of the Slaughter since I realized I reached crit cap. Minimum frenzy doesn't really matter, and traps don't let me benefit from on-kill effects, but with 7 frenzy charges being up almost all the time, this anoint provides a juicy 56% increased damage on the anoint slot alone. Belt and amulet are both slots that can have increased trap throwing speed, which is a veiled mod and can be crafted from the bench. It's not really a big difference on the explosive trap, since 7 frenzy charges already give 70% increased trap throwing speed via charged trap support, but it's really noticeable on the unlinked bear trap, so I'd want at least one of those crafts in my build. On the boots, I went for high mobility and a bit of complementary suppression. For the chest, this really just needed a 6-link, but I made this with a lucky essence hit, so I decided to use it. I really like being able to get Hatred Aura effect and infinite frenzy charge sustain, and the onslaught and physical damage taken as elemental are nice bonuses. Because of Escape Artist, it would be better to have a lot of evasion here to get a bigger bonus to energy shield. The build guide I was following recommends a Kintsugi, which I may eventually upgrade to, but I'm also considering just crafting a better rare so I can keep the Hatred Aura effect scaling for more damage. Now, for those of you interested, we'll quickly go over my gem choices. We're running our main damage gem in the 6-link with charge traps for charge generation and bonuses, inspiration for charge generation and bonuses, concentrated effect for higher damage and more overlaps in a smaller area, increased critical damage for critical strike multiplier, as well as trap and mine damage for a large more multiplier. Before you get good critical strike chance, you can run increased critical strikes instead of trap and mine damage, but eventually this is better. I already went over the reservation gems I'm running in the helmet. I mentioned the Arcanist's brand setup, which casts both Elemental Weakness and Assassin's Mark. Since curses are quite costly and you still have to pay triggered costs, I run these on life tap so I don't run out of mana in situations where my recovery is reduced. I also put both Shield Charge and Frost Blink on Void Manipulation support so they don't deal elemental damage and I can run Elemental Reflect maps without killing myself with my movement skill. The mentioned Guardian's Blessing setup with Holy Relic and Zealotry is in the shield, and the cast when damage taken Immortal Call increased duration setup is in the boots with my Loose Bear Trap. Pantheons are designed to be situationally switchable between maps to help with certain effects, so they're not really build specific, but still people who are looking to follow a guide usually ask what Pantheons to run, so I quickly explain my choices here. I run the upgraded Soul of the Brine King for freeze immunity, reduced chill effect and stun mitigation. Eventually, when I get 100% ailment avoidance, I can replace this with either Solaris or Lunaris, but for now we need this to be immune against freezes. For the small Pantheon, I alternate based on my needs between Soul of Garakan for reduced shock effect, for maps that have shock ground or extra lightning damage maps, the upgraded Soul of Aberrath for immunity against Burning Ground, for maps with Burning Ground or when progressing Searing Exarch, and Soul of Shakari against poison maps. The biggest weaknesses of the build at this point, the fact that it has no real ailment avoidance. We only have the mastery that prevents ailments from suppressed spell damage, so only immune to ailments caused from spell hits, but still ground effects and attack hits can be very devastating and apply big shocks, chills, and ignites. This means I wouldn't run Simulacrum on this build, because in Simulacrum there are a lot of ailments, also the alternate ailments that we're inflicting ourselves, and I don't think the build would like having them on itself. It's also not the best or fastest mapper for the reasons explained, but it's good enough in this patch that I enjoy it, and I'm only now considering running a new character to maps so I have a little bit of faster mapper. Now, in terms of map mods that I would not recommend running with this build, I definitely have to mention, like with almost every build, no regeneration and less recovery, which you can run it if you put a mana flask into the build. I wouldn't recommend doing it. Reduced effect of non-curse auras, which is, don't do it because you don't have enough sustain. Spell suppression, because all your damage is spell damage and you don't want to make monsters too tanky, although you can run it. That's one you could definitely run. You don't want the monsters to avoid elemental ailments, and you don't necessarily want to give them additional accuracy. Now, I'm using this build to progress my Eater, so in terms of Eater altar mods, I would definitely try to avoid the reduced defense per frenzy charge, because with 7 frenzy charges, this brings you down to 0 evasion. And I would try to avoid stacking more than 4 extra damages between altars and map mods, because then you'll just get hit and drop dead eventually. And definitely avoid spell suppression, the mod that makes enemies have 100% suppression and prevent an additional 20 to 30% of suppressed spell damage, makes it so that in the worst case scenario they avoid 80% of your damage, and it's just very tedious. I mean, you can do it, I just would recommend against it. For future upgrades, I definitely would like to get real ailment avoidance in the build, like just 100% chance to avoid elemental ailments, so that I'm also immune against the alternate ailments, and I'm a little bit more free in terms of what Pantheons I pick. And I'm definitely considering getting Kintsugi, since that would be a huge protection against one-shots when you're doing almost exclusively bosses later on with this build. If you want to see the build in action and you want to see me take on the Uber bosses, which I definitely think the build is capable of, let's just see whether I'm able to do it. Tune in to the stream at twitch.tv/CatmasterOP. I also try to multi-stream at least twice per week to YouTube, so if you subscribe to the YouTube channel, you'll be notified when I go live. And of course, there's also the beautiful Faded Connections podcast, which you should definitely not miss. Now, I thank you for watching. Press like if you liked the video and subscribe for more content like this in the future. If you've purchased a paid subscription via either Patreon, Twitch, or YouTube, then your name is on the end screen. I thank you wholeheartedly, and I'll see you in the next video.
I know a lot of people want to send blankets or water. Just send your cash.